Between 1874 and 1889, St. Mary's Sanatorium in the remote hills of northern Wisconsin promised miraculous cures for ailments that traditional medicine had failed to treat. Desperate families from across the Midwest sent their loved ones to this isolated facility, trusting in the revolutionary treatments advertised by its charismatic founder, Dr. Edmund Whitmore. The sanatorium's promotional materials boasted an impressive recovery rate and testimonials from grateful patients who claimed to have been saved from certain death. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What those families never knew was that of the 623 patients who entered St. Mary's doors during its 15-year operation, only 89 ever returned home alive. The truth about what happened within those pristine white walls remained buried for decades, hidden beneath layers of falsified medical records and the strategic silence of Wisconsin's most influential families. It wasn't until a devastating blizzard in 1923 exposed the sanatorium's forgotten cemetery that investigators began to uncover the horrifying reality of Dr. Whitmore's medical empire. What they discovered challenged everything the medical community thought they knew about the limits of human experimentation and the depths of institutional evil disguised as healing. The story of St. Mary's Sanatorium begins in the aftermath of the devastating cholera outbreaks that swept through the Great Lakes region in the early 1870s. Wisconsin had been particularly hard hit, with entire communities wiped out and thousands left orphaned or widowed. Traditional medicine had proven powerless against the epidemic, leaving the public desperate for alternative treatments and miracle cures. Into this climate of medical uncertainty stepped Dr. Edmund Whitmore, a man whose credentials seemed impeccable, but whose true background would later prove to be as fabricated as his miraculous cure rates. Dr. Edmund Whitmore presented himself as a graduate of the prestigious Vienna Medical School, claiming to have studied under the renowned physicians who were revolutionizing European medicine. His tall, imposing figure commanded respect in any room he entered, and his silver beard and penetrating gray eyes gave him an air of wisdom that impressed even seasoned medical professionals. Whitmore spoke with authority about advanced European techniques that were supposedly decades ahead of American medical practice, describing treatments that combined the latest scientific discoveries with time-tested natural remedies. What made Whitmore particularly convincing was his apparent wealth and sophistication. He dressed in the finest imported clothing, carried himself with the bearing of European aristocracy, and demonstrated an encyclopedic knowledge of medical literature that impressed even skeptical physicians. His lectures at medical conferences drew standing room-only crowds, and his published papers in respected medical journals established him as a leading voice in progressive treatment methods. Behind this carefully constructed facade, however, was a man whose real name was Edward Walsh, a failed medical student from Chicago who had never set foot in Vienna and whose knowledge came not from prestigious universities but from years of studying medical texts in public libraries and observing procedures as a hospital orderly. The mastermind behind the sanatorium's business operations was Whitmore's supposed wife, Margaret Whitmore, a woman whose elegant appearance and refined mannerisms perfectly complemented her husband's scholarly image. Margaret handled all financial aspects of the sanatorium with the precision of a seasoned banker, maintaining detailed records of every transaction while projecting the image of a devoted wife supporting her husband's noble medical mission. Her background story claimed she was the daughter of a wealthy Philadelphia manufacturing family who had dedicated her fortune to advancing medical science, but investigation would later reveal that Margaret Henley had actually worked as a confidence artist in New York before partnering with Walsh in his elaborate medical deception. Her talent for reading people and understanding their deepest fears and desires made her invaluable in identifying which patients could be exploited most effectively and which families were wealthy enough to pay premium rates for extended treatment. The sanatorium's head nurse, Catherine Morrison, brought a different kind of expertise to the operation. A genuine graduate of a Chicago nursing school, Morrison had been dismissed from 3 different hospitals for what administrators delicately described as excessive enthusiasm in her treatment methods. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her knowledge of actual medical procedures lent credibility to the sanatorium's operations, while her willingness to inflict pain in the name of healing made her the perfect instrument for Whitmore's more experimental treatments. Morrison genuinely believed that suffering was an essential component of the healing process, and that patients who complained about pain were simply demonstrating their lack of commitment to recovery. Her nursing background allowed her to monitor patients' vital signs during procedures, ensuring they remained conscious and responsive throughout treatments that would have killed them if administered by someone less skilled in keeping the human body functioning at the edge of survival. Dr. Harrison Fletcher served as the sanatorium's assistant physician, a position that gave him access to patients while maintaining plausible deniability about the more extreme aspects of their treatment. Fletcher was a legitimate medical school graduate whose career had been derailed by allegations of inappropriate conduct with female patients at his previous hospital position. Rather than face a formal investigation, he had quietly relocated to Wisconsin, where Whitmore offered him a chance to continue practicing medicine without the scrutiny of medical boards or hospital administrators. Fletcher's genuine medical knowledge made him valuable for maintaining the sanatorium's credible appearance, while his own history of boundary violations made him unlikely to question or report Whitmore's increasingly extreme methods. His role involved conducting intake examinations, writing official medical reports, and providing testimony to families about their loved ones' progress, all while remaining deliberately ignorant of what actually happened during the private treatment sessions that formed the core of the sanatorium's operations. The final key member of Whitmore's inner circle was Thomas Bradley, the sanatorium's administrator and Whitmore's connection to Wisconsin's political and business elite. Bradley had previously worked as a clerk in the state capitol building, where he had developed relationships with legislators, judges, and businessmen who would prove essential to protecting the sanatorium from official scrutiny. His understanding of how state government functioned allowed the sanatorium to navigate regulatory requirements, while his personal connections ensured that any complaints or concerns were quietly redirected or dismissed. Bradley's legitimate government experience lent credibility to the sanatorium's legal standing, while his network of political contacts created a protective barrier that kept investigators at bay for over a decade. St. Mary's Sanatorium was constructed in 1873 on a remote hilltop 20 miles north of the small lumber town of Pine Ridge, Wisconsin. The location had been carefully chosen for its isolation, beautiful natural setting, and proximity to railroad lines that allowed easy transport of patients while keeping the facility far from casual observers. The main building was an impressive 4-story structure built in the fashionable Victorian Gothic style, with soaring towers, ornate stonework, and expansive windows that gave it the appearance of a luxury resort rather than a medical facility. The building's design incorporated the latest architectural trends while hiding features that served more sinister purposes, including soundproof treatment rooms, hidden passages between floors, and basement chambers that didn't appear on any official building plans. The sanatorium's public areas were furnished with expensive imported furniture, original artwork, and medical equipment that represented the cutting edge of 1870s technology. Visitors were invariably impressed by the facility's obvious expense and attention to detail, which reinforced the impression that patients were receiving the finest possible care. The dining rooms featured crystal chandeliers and mahogany tables where patients dined on meals prepared by trained chefs, while the Common areas included libraries, music rooms, and conservatories filled with exotic plants. These public spaces were designed to impress visiting family members and potential investors, while concealing the facility's true purpose behind a facade of luxury and sophistication. What visitors never saw were the treatment areas located in the building's basement and isolated wing sections, where Whitmore conducted his experimental procedures away from prying eyes. These rooms were equipped with restraining devices, surgical instruments of questionable purpose, and monitoring equipment that allowed staff to observe patients' reactions to various stimuli. The basement also contained what Whitmore called his research laboratory, where he maintained detailed records of patient responses to different treatments and developed new procedures based on his observations of human pain tolerance and psychological breaking points. The sanatorium's marketing materials promised revolutionary treatments that combined the latest European medical advances with America's natural healing traditions. Whitmore claimed to have developed unique procedures for treating conditions that conventional medicine considered incurable, including advanced consumption, nervous disorders, chronic pain, and various forms of mental instability. His advertisements appeared in newspapers across the Midwest, targeting families who had exhausted traditional medical options and were desperate for alternatives. The promotional literature featured testimonials from supposedly cured patients and endorsements from prominent physicians who had allegedly observed Whitmore's miraculous results firsthand. What made the sanatorium's marketing particularly effective was its emphasis on scientific credibility combined with personal attention. Whitmore promised that each patient would receive individualized treatment based on detailed examination and diagnosis, with therapy programs designed specifically for their unique condition and constitution. The high cost of treatment was presented as evidence of its exclusivity and effectiveness, with families told that they were investing in access to medical knowledge that was unavailable anywhere else in America. The sanatorium's remote location was marketed as beneficial for healing, providing patients with pure air, natural beauty, and freedom from the stresses of urban life that allegedly contributed to their illnesses. The reality of treatment at St. Mary's Sanatorium bore no resemblance to the healing sanctuary described in its promotional materials. Patients were subjected to procedures that Whitmore claimed were based on advanced European research but were actually experimental tortures, designed to test the limits of human endurance while generating detailed data about pain responses and psychological manipulation. The treatments were presented as necessary suffering that would purge patients of the underlying causes of their illnesses, with any resistance or complaint interpreted as evidence that the patient lacked the moral strength necessary for recovery. Whitmore had developed an elaborate theoretical framework that justified his procedures as cutting-edge medical science. He claimed that most chronic illnesses were caused by moral weakness and spiritual corruption that had manifested as physical symptoms, requiring treatments that addressed both the body and the soul through intensive purification processes. His theory held that patients needed to experience controlled suffering in order to build the character strength necessary to overcome their ailments, while also allowing their bodies to eliminate the toxins and impurities that conventional medicine had been unable to address. This philosophical approach provided justification for procedures that would otherwise be recognized as torture, while convincing many patients that their suffering was evidence of the treatment's effectiveness. The sanatorium's patient intake process was designed to identify individuals who could be exploited most effectively while ensuring that those most likely to cause problems were either rejected or quickly eliminated. Potential patients underwent extensive interviews that were presented as comprehensive medical evaluations, but were actually psychological assessments designed to determine their vulnerability to manipulation, their family's financial resources, and their likelihood of complying with treatment protocols. Whitmore was particularly interested in patients who came from wealthy families, had few social connections, and suffered from conditions that could worsen without obvious external cause. Families seeking treatment for their loved ones were required to sign extensive legal documents that granted the sanatorium broad authority over patient care while limiting their own rights to visit or communicate with patients during treatment. These agreements were presented as standard medical consent forms, but their actual language gave Whitmore virtually unlimited power over patients while protecting the sanatorium from legal challenges if treatments proved unsuccessful. The documents also included clauses that prevented families from discussing treatment methods with outsiders and required them to pay substantial financial penalties if they removed patients before completing their prescribed course of therapy. Once patients entered the sanatorium, they were quickly isolated from outside contact and subjected to procedures designed to break down their psychological resistance while making them completely dependent on their captors for survival. The process began with what Whitmore called diagnostic evaluation, during which patients were stripped, examined, and subjected to various tests that were actually designed to humiliate and disorient them rather than assess their medical condition. Patients were told that their modesty and discomfort were symptoms of the moral weakness that had caused their illness, and that overcoming these feelings was essential to their recovery. The daily routine at St. Mary's was carefully structured to maintain control over patients while generating maximum profit from their captivity. Patients were awakened before dawn for meditation sessions that were actually psychological conditioning, designed to break down their sense of individual identity and personal will. These sessions, led by Morrison, involved repetitive exercises that induced trance-like states during which patients became highly susceptible to suggestion and manipulation. The morning routine also included what staff called purification treatments, which involved various forms of physical discomfort that were presented as necessary for eliminating toxins from patient systems. Meals at the sanatorium were carefully controlled to maintain patients in a weakened state while avoiding obvious malnutrition that might attract attention from visiting family members. The dining room fare served to visitors was completely different from what patients actually received, with elaborate meals prepared for show while patients subsisted on minimal rations, designed to keep them compliant and dependent. Whitmore claimed that reduced food intake was essential for the healing process, allowing patients' bodies to focus energy on recovery rather than digestion. But the real purpose was to ensure that patients lacked the physical strength necessary for resistance or escape attempts. The afternoon hours were dedicated to individual treatment sessions that formed the core of Whitmore's experimental program. These sessions, conducted in the basement treatment rooms, involved procedures that Whitmore described as advanced therapeutic techniques but were actually systematic torture designed to test patients' pain tolerance while gathering data for his research. Each session was carefully documented, with detailed notes about patients' physical and psychological responses to different stimuli. Whitmore maintained that this research would eventually lead to breakthrough treatments that would revolutionize medicine, but his real interest lay in understanding how far human beings could be pushed before they broke completely. Evening activities included group therapy sessions where patients were encouraged to confess their moral failings and express gratitude for the opportunity to undergo purification through suffering. These sessions served multiple purposes, reinforcing patients' sense of guilt and worthlessness while identifying those who retained enough independence to pose potential threats to the operation. Patients who expressed doubt about their treatment or concern about their condition were marked for more intensive intervention, while those who demonstrated complete submission were rewarded with slightly better conditions that encouraged other patients to follow their example. The sanatorium's financial operations were as sophisticated as its psychological manipulation techniques, with multiple revenue streams that generated enormous profits while maintaining the appearance of a legitimate medical facility. The basic treatment fees were substantial, miraculous, as evidence of the facility's exclusivity and effectiveness, but additional charges for specialized procedures, extended treatment periods, and premium accommodations could multiply costs dramatically. Families desperate to help their loved ones were often willing to pay whatever was necessary, and the sanatorium's contracts included provisions that allowed for indefinite extension of treatment periods if staff determined that patients required additional therapy. Whitmore had also developed relationships with insurance companies and fraternal organizations that provided coverage for extended medical treatment, allowing him to collect payments from multiple sources for the same patients. His reputation as a pioneering physician convinced many organizations that coverage of his treatments represented progressive healthcare policy, while his detailed medical reports provided documentation that satisfied their requirements for reimbursement. The sanatorium's legitimate medical credentials and impressive facilities made it easy for insurance investigators to approve claims without deeper examination of actual treatment methods. The facility generated additional income through what Whitmore called medical education programs, where physicians from other institutions paid substantial fees to observe his revolutionary treatment techniques. These programs provided credibility for the sanatorium's methods while generating revenue from medical professionals who were convinced they were witnessing breakthrough procedures. The visiting physician saw only carefully staged demonstrations with cooperative patients, never suspecting that they were observing the results of months of psychological conditioning rather than genuine medical progress. Perhaps most disturbing was the sanatorium's body trade, through which organs and tissues from deceased patients were sold to medical schools and research institutions across the country. Whitmore claimed that his patients had donated their bodies to science as part of their commitment to advancing medical knowledge. But the reality was that families were never informed about these arrangements and never consented to the commercial use of their loved ones' remains. The income from this trade was substantial, as medical schools were willing to pay premium prices for well-preserved specimens, and Whitmore's techniques for maintaining bodies in good condition made his offerings particularly valuable to anatomical researchers. The network of corruption that protected St. Mary's Sanatorium extended far beyond the medical community, reaching into Wisconsin's highest levels of government, business, and social influence. Judge William Hartwell of the Superior County Court had become Whitmore's most valuable ally, using his judicial authority to commit patients to the sanatorium while blocking any legal challenges to its operations. Hartwell presented himself as a progressive advocate for advanced medical treatment, often lecturing other judges about the importance of supporting innovative healthcare institutions that serve the public good. Behind this reformist facade, however, lay a man whose gambling debts and extramarital affairs had made him vulnerable to blackmail and financial manipulation by Whitmore's organization. Hartwell's courtroom became a funnel for directing vulnerable individuals toward the sanatorium, particularly those whose families possessed significant financial resources or whose disappearance would cause minimal public concern. The judge had developed expertise in interpreting Wisconsin's commitment laws in ways that allowed him to order extended institutional treatment for individuals whose mental or physical conditions were often marginal at best. His legal rulings were rarely challenged because they appeared to be motivated by genuine concern for public welfare and advanced medical care, while his reputation for thorough consideration of evidence made his decisions seem beyond reproach. What court observers never realized was that many of the medical evaluations Hartwell relied upon had been prepared by Dr. Fletcher, specifically to support predetermined outcomes rather than provide objective assessments of patient needs. Sheriff Robert McKenzie controlled law enforcement in the 3 counties surrounding the sanatorium, using his authority to discourage investigations and redirect complaints away from official channels. McKenzie had built his political career on a platform of supporting progressive institutions and modern approaches to social problems, making him a natural ally for Whitmore's supposedly advanced medical facility. His deputies were instructed to treat any concerns about the sanatorium as evidence of ignorance about modern medical practice, while families asking questions about missing relatives were told that patient confidentiality prevented disclosure of information about ongoing treatment. Mackenzie's office maintained a file of form letters explaining that the sanatorium's privacy policies were designed to protect patients from interference that might disrupt their recovery, and these responses were sufficient to satisfy most inquiries without providing any actual information about patient welfare. The sheriff's protection of the sanatorium extended beyond passive negligence to active suppression of evidence that might threaten the facility's operations. Deputies were assigned to patrol the roads leading to the sanatorium, ostensibly to provide security for the medical facility, but actually to monitor who was visiting and to intercept any unauthorized attempts to investigate the grounds. Mackenzie had also established relationships with postal officials that allowed him to monitor mail sent to and from the sanatorium, ensuring that any communications that might reveal problematic information were redirected or lost before reaching their intended recipients. This surveillance network created an information barrier around the facility that prevented outside observers from gathering accurate intelligence about what was actually happening to patients. Wisconsin State Senator Charles Morrison had become the sanatorium's most important political protector, using his legislative influence to block regulatory oversight while promoting policies that increased the facility's authority over patient care. Morrison genuinely believed that institutions like St. Mary's represented the future of American healthcare, combining scientific innovation with compassionate treatment in ways that traditional hospitals could never achieve. His legislative efforts focused on expanding the rights of medical facilities to conduct research and implement experimental treatments, while reducing bureaucratic interference that might discourage medical innovation. Morrison's support for progressive healthcare policy made him popular with educated voters who saw him as a forward-thinking leader committed to advancing Wisconsin's reputation for social reform. What Morrison never understood was that his well-intentioned policies were being exploited by criminals who used his legislative protections to commit crimes that would have been impossible under more restrictive oversight. His advocacy for patient privacy rights inadvertently made it easier for facilities to conceal abuse, while his support for medical research exemptions provided legal cover for procedures that had no legitimate therapeutic purpose. Morrison's office received regular reports from the sanatorium about their pioneering research and impressive treatment outcomes, information that reinforced his belief that he was supporting genuinely beneficial medical work rather than enabling systematic exploitation. The sanatorium's influence extended into Wisconsin's business community through relationships with some of the state's most successful entrepreneurs and industrialists. Railroad magnate Harrison Blackwood had invested heavily in the sanatorium's construction and operations, viewing it as both a profitable venture and a philanthropic contribution to advancing medical science. Blackwood's railroad connections made it easy for the sanatorium to transport patients from distant locations while maintaining secrecy about their numbers and conditions, with special private cars arranged for wealthy families who wanted discreet medical treatment for their relatives. His investment also provided the sanatorium with financial resources that allowed it to maintain its impressive facade while funding the expensive equipment and facilities necessary for Whitmore's experimental procedures. Lumber baron Frederick Walsh controlled vast timber holdings in northern Wisconsin, including the forests surrounding the sanatorium, which provided both privacy and a convenient method for disposing of evidence that might threaten the facility's operations. Walsh's logging crews were instructed to avoid certain areas near the sanatorium and to report any unusual discoveries to facility administrators rather than local authorities. His business relationship with the sanatorium included providing wood for construction projects and maintenance, but also extended to more disturbing arrangements that involved using his logging operations to conceal activities that would have attracted unwanted attention if conducted through normal channels. Banking magnate Edward Sullivan controlled the financial institutions that handled the sanatorium's complex monetary transactions, ensuring that large cash transfers and unusual payment patterns never attracted regulatory scrutiny. Sullivan's banks provided loans that funded the sanatorium's expansion, while laundering profits through legitimate investment vehicles that concealed the true source of the facility's income. His understanding of financial regulations allowed the sanatorium to structure its operations in ways that appeared completely legal while actually violating numerous laws regarding medical practice, patient rights, and business operations. Sullivan's protection was essential because the sanatorium's income levels and spending patterns would have triggered investigations if subjected to normal banking oversight. The medical community's support for St. Mary's Sanatorium was carefully cultivated through an elaborate program of professional development and educational outreach that convinced legitimate physicians that they were witnessing revolutionary advances in healthcare. Dr. Benjamin Crawford, dean of the Wisconsin Medical College, regularly brought students to observe the sanatorium's supposedly innovative treatments, providing credibility that enhanced Whitmore's reputation throughout the regional medical community. Crawford genuinely believed that the sanatorium represented the kind of institutional innovation that would establish Wisconsin as a leader in progressive healthcare, and his endorsement carried enormous weight with other medical professionals who respected his judgment and experience. The visiting physicians who observed procedures at the sanatorium saw only carefully orchestrated demonstrations with patients who had been selected and prepared specifically for these presentations. Whitmore's staff became expert at identifying patients who could be trusted to perform appropriately during visits, while those who might reveal problematic information were kept away from observers or heavily sedated during demonstration periods. The medical visitors interpreted patient compliance and apparent cooperation as evidence of successful treatment rather than recognizing it as the result of psychological conditioning and physical intimidation that had broken down normal resistance. Responses. Religious leaders throughout Wisconsin praised the sanatorium for its integration of spiritual healing with advanced medical treatment, seeing it as a model for institutions that addressed both physical and moral aspects of human suffering. Reverend Samuel Phillips of Madison's largest Presbyterian church served on the sanatorium's board of directors, lending religious authority to an institution that claimed to heal both body and soul through carefully designed therapeutic interventions. Phillips genuinely believed that the sanatorium's high success rates demonstrated God's blessing on their work, and his sermons often featured stories about miraculous recoveries that illustrated the power of faith combined with scientific medicine. The Reverend's involvement provided cover for aspects of the sanatorium's operations that might otherwise have seemed questionable, as his moral authority convinced other religious leaders that any unusual procedures must be justified by their therapeutic effectiveness. Phillips conducted regular prayer services at the sanatorium that were attended by patients, staff, and visiting family members, creating an atmosphere of spiritual devotion that reinforced the impression that everything conducted at the facility served higher purposes than mere medical treatment. His presence also provided comfort to families who were concerned about leaving their loved ones in an unfamiliar institutional environment, as his endorsement suggested that patients would receive spiritual as well as physical care. The sanatorium's patient population was carefully managed to maximize both financial returns and experimental opportunities while minimizing the risk of exposure through escaped patients or concerned family members. Whitmore had developed sophisticated criteria for evaluating potential patients that went far beyond their medical conditions to include assessments of their family's wealth, social connections, and likelihood of causing problems if treatment outcomes proved disappointing. Patients from prominent families received different treatment than those from more modest backgrounds, with wealthy patients often experiencing relatively mild procedures that produced visible improvements while poorer patients were subjected to the most dangerous experimental protocols. The intake process included extensive interviews with family members that were presented as comprehensive medical history taking, but were actually intelligence-gathering operations designed to identify potential vulnerabilities and pressure points that could be exploited if families became problematic. Staff members were trained to ask seemingly innocent questions about family relationships, financial situations, and social networks that provided detailed profiles of each patient's external support system. This information was used to predict how much abuse each patient could endure before their disappearance or deterioration would attract unwanted attention, allowing staff to calibrate treatment intensity based on risk assessment rather than medical necessity. Patients who entered the sanatorium discovered that their contact with the outside world was immediately and completely severed, ostensibly to protect their recovery process from harmful external influences. All mail was intercepted and reviewed by staff before being destroyed or heavily edited, while visitors were limited to brief supervised meetings in public areas where normal conversation was impossible. Patients were told that these restrictions were temporary measures that would be lifted as their condition improved, but in reality they were permanent features designed to prevent information about actual treatment methods from reaching family members or authorities who might intervene on patients' behalf. The facility's record-keeping system was designed to create false documentation that would satisfy official inquiries while concealing the true nature of patient treatment and outcomes. Multiple sets of records were maintained for each patient, including sanitized versions that could be shown to family members or investigators, detailed clinical notes that tracked experimental procedures and patient responses, and financial records that documented the various revenue streams generated by each individual case. This documentation system allowed staff to provide convincing evidence of appropriate medical care while maintaining detailed information about procedures that would have been recognized as criminal if discovered by outside observers. Patient deaths were handled through an elaborate system of false documentation and body disposal that prevented accurate mortality statistics from reaching public attention. Death certificates were routinely falsified to show natural causes, even when patients had died from experimental procedures, while bodies were disposed of through arrangements with local funeral homes that asked no questions about unusual injury patterns or suspicious circumstances. The sanatorium maintained its own crematorium, ostensibly for sanitary purposes but actually to ensure that physical evidence of abuse was permanently destroyed before it could be examined by skeptical observers. Families who inquired about deceased relatives were provided with detailed explanations about how their loved ones had fought bravely against their illnesses before succumbing to conditions that had been too advanced for even the most innovative treatments to cure. These explanations were delivered with apparent compassion and scientific authority that convinced most families that everything possible had been done to save their relatives, while also suggesting that the patient's deaths had contributed valuable knowledge that would help save future patients with similar conditions. The emotional manipulation involved in these communications was designed to transform grief into gratitude while discouraging further questions about specific treatment methods or facility procedures. The daily reality inside St. Mary's Sanatorium bore no resemblance to the healing sanctuary described in promotional materials or witnessed by carefully managed visitors. Patients awakened each morning at 4 o'clock to the sound of brass bells that echoed through the corridors like funeral chimes, beginning a ritualized process of degradation disguised as therapeutic routine. The awakening ceremony, conducted by Nurse Morrison with military precision, required patients to stand beside their beds in thin hospital gowns, regardless of the coldness of the Wisconsin winter temperatures that made the unheated dormitories nearly unbearable. Any patient who failed to respond immediately to the bells faced punishment that Morrison described as corrective therapy designed to strengthen their commitment to recovery. The morning ablutions were conducted in communal washrooms, where patients were required to bathe in ice-cold water while staff members observed and documented their physical condition for what they claimed were ongoing medical assessments. These daily examinations served multiple purposes beyond simple humiliation, as staff members carefully noted changes in patients' weight, muscle tone, and overall physical deterioration that indicated how much additional stress each individual could withstand before reaching complete physical collapse. Patients who showed signs of dangerous weakness were either moved to different treatment protocols or quietly transferred to what staff euphemistically called the recovery wing, a section of the building from which no patient had ever returned. Breakfast consisted of thin porridge made from spoiled oats and stale bread crusts, portions carefully calculated to provide just enough nutrition to maintain basic bodily functions while ensuring that patients remained in a weakened state that discouraged resistance or escape attempts. Dr. Whitmore had developed elaborate theories about how reduced caloric intake enhanced the body's natural healing processes by forcing it to eliminate toxins and strengthen essential systems. But the real purpose was maintaining patients in a condition of chronic hunger that made them grateful for any small improvement in their treatment. Staff members ate hearty meals prepared by the same kitchen that produced the patient's meager rations, a contrast that was deliberately obvious to reinforce the power dynamic between captors and captives. The morning meal was followed by what Morrison called therapeutic exercise, sessions conducted in the basement gymnasium where patients were forced to perform exhausting physical routines, designed to push their weakened bodies beyond their capabilities. These exercises were presented as essential for rebuilding strength and endurance, but they were actually calculated to exhaust patients, both physically and mentally, while providing opportunities for staff to identify those who retained enough spirit to potentially cause problems. Patients who collapsed during exercise were carried to the medical ward for additional treatment, while those who completed the routines were rewarded with slightly larger food portions that encouraged others to push themselves beyond safe limits. The afternoon hours brought individual assessment sessions that formed the core of Whitmore's experimental program. Meetings conducted in soundproof chambers, located in the building's basement levels where no screens could reach the upper floors. Occupied by visiting family members or inspecting officials. These sessions were presented to patients as personalized medical consultations, where their progress would be evaluated and their treatment plans adjusted based on their individual responses to therapy. The reality was far more sinister, as these meetings provided opportunities for Whitmore and his associates to conduct procedures that had no legitimate medical purpose beyond satisfying their curiosity about human pain tolerance and psychological breaking points. Each assessment session was meticulously documented in ledgers that recorded patients' physical and emotional responses to various stimuli, creating detailed profiles that Whitmore claimed would advance medical understanding of chronic conditions and treatment resistance. Patients were subjected to procedures that ranged from merely uncomfortable to genuinely life-threatening, with the intensity of treatment determined not by medical necessity, but by Whitmore's assessment of how much abuse each individual could endure before becoming useless for further experimentation. The doctor maintained that these procedures were based on advanced European research that had not yet been published in American medical journals, giving him complete freedom to experiment without reference to established medical protocols or ethical guidelines. The treatment rooms themselves had been designed with the same attention to detail that characterized every aspect of the sanatorium's operations, featuring equipment that appeared to be sophisticated medical apparatus but was actually torture devices disguised as therapeutic instruments. Restraining tables were presented as positioning devices necessary for precise medical procedures, while various mechanical contraptions were described as innovative tools for applying controlled pressure or electrical stimulation to specific areas of the body. Patients were told that their discomfort during these procedures was evidence that the treatments were successfully addressing the root causes of their conditions, while any cries of pain were interpreted as the release of toxins and negative energy that had been trapped in their systems. Whitmore had developed an elaborate classification system for categorizing patients based on their responses to different types of treatment, allowing him to match experimental procedures with individuals who were most likely to provide useful data while minimizing the risk of premature death that would waste valuable research subjects. Some patients were designated as endurance subjects, individuals whose robust constitutions made them suitable for testing the limits of human physical tolerance, while others were classified as psychological subjects whose mental characteristics made them ideal for exploring the relationship between emotional trauma and physical symptoms. A third category consisted of combination subjects, who were subjected to procedures that tested both physical and mental resilience simultaneously. The medical records maintained for each patient created the illusion of scientific rigor while actually documenting systematic abuse that would have been immediately recognized as criminal if examined by legitimate medical professionals. Whitmore's notes described patient responses using clinical terminology that disguised torture as treatment, referring to screaming as vocalization responses and unconsciousness as therapeutic dissociation states. His detailed observations about how different individuals reacted to various forms of stress were written in the objective language of scientific research, creating documents that could be presented as legitimate medical studies while actually serving as instruction manuals for more effective torture techniques. Evening activities included group sessions, where patients were encouraged to discuss their treatment experiences and express gratitude for the opportunity to participate in advanced medical research that would benefit future sufferers of similar conditions. These meetings served multiple purposes, allowing staff to identify patients who were adapting well to their circumstances while also reinforcing the message that resistance to treatment was selfish behavior that demonstrated lack of concern for medical progress. Patients who spoke positively about their experiences received small privileges such as additional blankets or slightly better food, while those who expressed doubts or concerns were marked for more intensive individual attention, designed to adjust their attitudes. The group sessions also functioned as intelligence-gathering operations where staff members could observe patient interactions and identify relationships that might pose security risks if they developed into mutual support systems. Patients who showed signs of forming friendships or alliances were separated and subjected to treatments designed to break down their emotional connections to other inmates. Morrison had developed sophisticated techniques for manipulating patient relationships, using privileges and punishments to create competitive dynamics that prevented solidarity while encouraging patients to inform on each other in hopes of improving their own treatment conditions. The sanatorium's financial operations had evolved into a sophisticated system for extracting maximum profit from each patient while maintaining the appearance of a legitimate medical facility providing premium healthcare services. The basic treatment fees were substantial enough to ensure that only wealthy families could afford care, but additional charges for specialized procedures, extended treatment periods, and premium accommodations could multiply costs dramatically, without providing any corresponding improvement in actual treatment quality. Families desperate to help their loved ones were often willing to authorize whatever expenses were necessary, particularly when Whitmore provided detailed explanations about how additional treatments would accelerate recovery or prevent dangerous complications. Whitmore had also developed relationships with life insurance companies that provided coverage for experimental medical treatments, allowing him to collect payments from multiple sources for the same patients while maintaining detailed documentation that satisfied insurance investigators without revealing the true nature of his procedures. His reputation as a pioneering physician convinced many companies that coverage of his treatments represented progressive healthcare policy that would ultimately reduce long-term medical costs by providing more effective treatments for chronic conditions. The insurance payments provided a steady income stream that was less dependent on family resources, allowing the sanatorium to maintain profitability even when wealthy patients were not readily available. The facility generated additional revenue through what Whitmore called medical consultation services, where physicians from other institutions paid substantial fees to observe his revolutionary treatment techniques and learn methods that they could implement in their own practices. These programs provided credibility for the sanatorium's methods while generating income from medical professionals who were convinced they were witnessing breakthrough procedures that would advance their careers and improve patient outcomes. The visiting physicians saw only carefully choreographed demonstrations with cooperative patients who had been selected and prepared specifically for these presentations, never suspecting that they were observing the results of months of psychological conditioning rather than genuine medical progress. Perhaps most disturbing was the sanatorium's development of what Whitmore called therapeutic partnerships with wealthy individuals who were interested in supporting medical research through direct participation in treatment procedures. These arrangements allowed prominent citizens to contribute to advancing medical science while experiencing the satisfaction of personally helping suffering patients through hands-on involvement in their care. The partnerships were presented as educational opportunities where concerned philanthropists could witness the healing process firsthand and better understand how their financial contributions were being used to benefit society. In reality, these programs provided wealthy sadists with opportunities to participate in systematic torture, while believing they were engaged in charitable work that demonstrated their commitment to social progress. The sanatorium maintained detailed records of partner preferences and patient responses that allowed staff to match participants with subjects who would provide the most satisfying experiences while ensuring that no permanent damage occurred that might interfere with ongoing treatment programs. These arrangements generated enormous revenue, while also creating a network of influential supporters who had personal investments in protecting the sanatorium from outside interference. Partners who had participated in treatment sessions were unlikely to support investigations that might expose their own involvement, creating a web of complicity that made the facility virtually immune to external scrutiny. The winter months brought particular challenges for maintaining the sanatorium's operations, as the isolated Wisconsin location made it difficult for families to visit their relatives and verify their condition. Whitmore used these periods of natural isolation to intensify his experimental programs, conducting procedures that were too dangerous or obvious to attempt when regular family visits might reveal their effects. The harsh weather also provided cover for disposing of patients who had died during treatment, as the frozen ground made burial impossible, while blizzards prevented transportation of bodies to distant locations where their deaths might attract less attention. Staff members understood that winter represented both opportunity and danger, as the same isolation that protected them from observation also made it impossible to quickly relocate or eliminate evidence if their activities were discovered. Morrison developed elaborate contingency plans for managing crisis situations that might arise during the long months when the sanatorium was effectively cut off from outside contact, including procedures for disposing of problematic patients and destroying incriminating records if investigators somehow managed to reach the facility during severe weather periods. The first crack in St. Mary's Sanatorium's carefully constructed facade appeared in the autumn of 1887 through the persistent efforts of Anna Richardson, a schoolteacher from Milwaukee whose younger sister Emily had disappeared into the facility. 18 months earlier, Emily Richardson had been committed to the sanatorium after suffering what physicians described as nervous exhaustion following the death of her infant daughter, a condition that her well-meaning family believed required the kind of specialized treatment that only Dr. Whitmore's revolutionary methods could provide. Anna had initially supported the decision to seek advanced medical care for her grieving sister, but her attempts to maintain contact through letters and visits had been systematically frustrated by staff members who claimed that external interference was disrupting Emily's delicate recovery process. Anna's suspicions began when her carefully written letters to Emily were returned unopened, with form explanations about how correspondence from family members could trigger emotional relapses that would undo months of therapeutic progress. The school teacher's education had taught her to question authority and seek evidence for claims that seemed inconsistent with logic or experience, skills that made her uniquely qualified to recognize the contradictions between the sanatorium's stated policies and their actual implementation. Her attempts to visit Emily were repeatedly postponed or canceled due to what staff described as medical emergencies or critical treatment periods that required absolute isolation, excuses that became increasingly implausible as months passed. Without any concrete information about her sister's condition or progress, the breaking point came when Anna received a letter supposedly written by Emily expressing gratitude for the wonderful treatment she was receiving and requesting that family members cease all contact until her recovery was complete. The handwriting was unmistakably Emily's, but the language and sentiments were completely foreign to her sister's personality and previous correspondence, suggesting that the letter had been written under duress or dictated by staff members. Anna's years as a teacher had made her expert at detecting deception in written work, and she immediately recognized that the letter represented either coercion or forgery, rather than Emily's genuine feelings about her situation. Determined to discover the truth about her sister's condition, Anna began a systematic investigation that would eventually expose the sanatorium's criminal operations and destroy the network of corruption that had protected it for over a decade. Her approach was methodical and careful, avoiding direct confrontation that might alert facility staff to her suspicions, while gathering evidence that could support official intervention if her fears proved justified. She began by researching Dr. Whitmore's background and credentials, a task that proved surprisingly difficult given his supposed prominence in the medical community and his claims about European training and experience. Anna's investigation revealed disturbing inconsistencies in Whitmore's professional history, including gaps in his timeline that could not be explained by legitimate medical education or practice. His supposed graduation from Vienna Medical School could not be verified through correspondence with Austrian academic institutions, while his published papers in American medical journals contained theoretical claims that were not supported by recognized European research. The schoolteacher's systematic approach to verification exposed a pattern of fabrication that extended throughout Whitmore's professional credentials, suggesting that his entire identity as a pioneering physician was constructed from fictional elements designed to impress unsuspecting observers. While researching Whitmore's background, Anna also began documenting other families who had sent relatives to St. Mary's Sanatorium, using public records and newspaper announcements to identify individuals who had been committed to the facility. Over the previous several years, her investigation revealed a disturbing pattern of wealthy patients who had entered the sanatorium for treatment of relatively minor conditions but had never returned home or been seen by their families again. The official explanations for these disappearances varied, but they shared common elements that suggested coordinated deception rather than legitimate medical outcomes. Anna discovered that at least 24 families had experienced situations similar to her own, with relatives who had been committed to the sanatorium and then gradually isolated from outside contact until all communication ceased completely. The families had been provided with various explanations for their loved ones' conditions, ranging from unexpected complications that required extended treatment to tragic deaths from previously undiagnosed illnesses that had proven resistant to even the most advanced therapeutic interventions. The consistency of these patterns suggested systematic deception rather than coincidental medical tragedies, providing Anna with evidence that the sanatorium's operations were far more sinister than their public reputation indicated. The schoolteacher's investigation attracted the attention of Dr. James Morrison, a legitimate physician from Madison who had become increasingly suspicious about Whitmore's claimed medical breakthroughs and the lack of published research supporting his supposedly revolutionary treatments. Morrison had attended several of the sanatorium's educational presentations and had been troubled by inconsistencies between Whitmore's theoretical claims and the limited evidence he provided to support his methods. The physician's medical training allowed him to recognize that many of Whitmore's procedures had no basis in established medical science, while his ethical commitment to patient welfare made him concerned about the welfare of individuals subjected to unproven experimental treatments. Dr. Morrison's involvement provided Anna's investigation with professional credibility and medical expertise that transformed her suspicions from personal concerns into legitimate questions about institutional practices that warranted official scrutiny. Together, they began documenting cases where patients had been subjected to treatments that appeared to have no therapeutic purpose beyond satisfying Whitmore's curiosity about human responses to various forms of stress and discomfort. Their collaborative investigation revealed evidence that the sanatorium was conducting unauthorized medical experiments on vulnerable patients who had no legal protection or advocacy beyond their families' concerns. The investigation gained momentum when they contacted Detective Lieutenant Samuel Hayes of the Wisconsin State Police, an experienced investigator who specialized in cases involving institutional fraud and corruption. Hayes had built his reputation on methodical investigation techniques and his willingness to pursue cases that other officers avoided due to political sensitivity or social prominence of potential suspects. His involvement provided the investigation with official authority and resources that allowed for more comprehensive examination of the sanatorium's operations, including surveillance activities that could document actual conditions inside the facility rather than relying on carefully managed public presentations. Lieutenant Hayes began his investigation by examining financial records associated with the sanatorium's operations, using his authority to access banking information and business documentation that revealed the enormous profits generated by the facility's treatment programs. The financial analysis showed revenue levels that were completely inconsistent with legitimate medical practice, suggesting either fraudulent billing practices or income from activities that were not disclosed in official reports to regulatory authorities. The detective's experience with financial crimes allowed him to recognize patterns that indicated systematic deception designed to conceal the true nature of the sanatorium's business operations. The investigation team's breakthrough came when they managed to establish contact with a former sanatorium employee who had left the facility after witnessing procedures that violated both medical ethics and criminal law. Thomas Brennan had worked as a maintenance supervisor at the sanatorium for 3 years, before resigning due to what he described as increasing discomfort with activities he observed while performing routine building repairs and equipment maintenance. Brennan's position had given him access to areas of the facility that were normally restricted to medical staff, allowing him to witness procedures and conditions that contradicted the sanatorium's public claims about patient care and treatment. Methods. Brennan's testimony provided the investigation team with detailed insider information about the sanatorium's actual operations, including descriptions of treatment rooms that were designed for restraining patients rather than providing medical care, and equipment that appeared to be torture devices disguised as therapeutic instruments. His account of staff conversations and administrative meetings revealed that facility personnel were fully aware that their activities constituted abuse rather than treatment, but that they justified their actions through elaborate rationalizations about advancing medical science and helping patients overcome resistance to necessary therapeutic interventions. The maintenance supervisor's evidence included detailed knowledge of the sanatorium's physical layout, including basement areas and hidden chambers that did not appear on official building plans, but were used for procedures that required complete secrecy from potential observers. Brennan described systematic efforts to soundproof these areas and install equipment that would prevent any noise from reaching the upper floors where visiting family members or official inspectors might be present. His testimony provided crucial evidence that the sanatorium's design had been deliberately modified to facilitate activities that its operators knew would be criminal if discovered by outside authorities. Armed with Brennan's testimony and their accumulated evidence of financial irregularities and medical fraud, the investigation team petitioned Judge William Hartwell for a warrant to conduct a comprehensive search of the sanatorium's facilities and records. The petition presented detailed allegations of patient abuse, financial fraud, and criminal conspiracy that warranted immediate intervention to protect potentially endangered individuals and preserve evidence of ongoing criminal activities. The team expected that Hartwell's reputation for supporting progressive medical institutions might make him reluctant to authorize such an intrusive investigation, but they believed their evidence was compelling enough to overcome any initial skepticism. Judge Hartwell's response to the warrant request was unexpectedly evasive, with the judge claiming that he needed additional time to review the complex legal issues involved in investigating a prominent medical facility that served patients from across the region. His delay tactics included requests for additional documentation and legal briefs that seemed designed to provide the sanatorium with advance warning about the investigation rather than facilitate prompt action to protect potential victims. The judge's behavior struck Lieutenant Hayes as suspicious given the urgency of the situation and the strength of the evidence presented, suggesting that Hartwell might have personal or financial connections to the sanatorium that created conflicts of interest. The investigation team's suspicions about judicial interference were confirmed when their surveillance activities detected unusual nighttime activity at the sanatorium, including the transport of materials from the facility to locations where they could be destroyed or concealed from investigators. Staff members were observed removing documents and equipment under cover of darkness, activities that suggested they had received advance warning about the pending investigation and were taking steps to eliminate evidence that might support criminal charges. This destruction of evidence convinced Lieutenant Hayes that immediate action was necessary to prevent the complete elimination of materials that would be essential for prosecuting the sanatorium's operators. The detective's decision to proceed with an emergency search based on probable cause and exigent circumstances led to a confrontation that would finally expose the full horror of St. Mary's Sanatorium and destroy the network of corruption that had protected its operations for over a decade. On the morning of November 15, 1888, Lieutenant Hayes led a team of state police officers in a raid on the sanatorium that was designed to secure evidence and protect any patients who might be in immediate danger from staff members who knew that their criminal activities were about to be exposed. The raid team's entry into the sanatorium revealed conditions that exceeded even their worst expectations about institutional abuse and medical fraud. The basement treatment rooms contained equipment and materials that provided unmistakable evidence of systematic torture conducted under the guise of medical treatment, while patient records documented procedures that had no legitimate therapeutic purpose beyond satisfying the sadistic curiosities of staff members and paying clients. The discovery of these facilities and documents provided irrefutable proof that the sanatorium had been operating as a criminal enterprise that used medical authority as cover for activities that violated every principle of human decency and professional ethics. Perhaps most shocking was the discovery of patients and conditions that demonstrated the effects of prolonged abuse and neglect, individuals whose physical and mental deterioration provided living testimony to the horrors they had endured during their captivity. The rescue of these survivors would provide crucial witness testimony that would eventually convict the sanatorium's operators, while also revealing the full scope of the criminal conspiracy that had enabled such systematic abuse to continue. for over a decade without detection or intervention by authorities, who should have been protecting vulnerable patients from institutional exploitation. The trials that followed the raid on St. Mary's Sanatorium became the most sensational legal proceedings in Wisconsin history, drawing reporters from across the nation who struggled to convey the full extent of the horrors that had been uncovered. In the supposedly progressive medical facility, Dr. Edmund Whitmore, whose real identity as Edward Walsh was finally exposed during the proceedings, faced 17 counts of murder and dozens of additional charges related to fraud, conspiracy, and criminal abuse of patients under his care. His defense attorney's attempts to portray him as a dedicated physician, whose methods had been misunderstood by ignorant investigators, collapsed when survivors testified about procedures that had no conceivable medical purpose beyond inflicting suffering. Margaret Whitmore received a life sentence for her role in the financial operations that had funded the sanatorium's criminal activities, though she maintained until her death in 1923 that she had believed her husband's claims about conducting legitimate medical research. Her detailed financial records, preserved despite attempts to destroy evidence, provided prosecutors with documentation of payments to corrupt officials and the complex money laundering schemes that had concealed the sanatorium's true revenue sources. The judge noted during sentencing that her systematic bookkeeping had enabled crimes that might otherwise have been discovered much earlier, making her an essential partner in the conspiracy rather than an innocent victim of deception. Nurse Catherine Morrison was executed by hanging 1891, becoming the first woman in Wisconsin history to receive the death penalty for crimes committed in a medical setting. Her final statement expressed no remorse for her actions, instead claiming that weak patients who complained about treatment had demonstrated their unfitness for recovery, and that her methods had actually helped them achieve peaceful deaths rather than prolonged suffering. The callousness of her testimony shocked even hardened court observers and reinforced public demands for the harshest possible punishment for all those involved in the sanatorium's operations. Dr. Harrison Fletcher avoided execution by providing detailed testimony about the sanatorium's operations and the network of corruption that had protected it. But his cooperation came too late to save him from a life sentence that he served until his death from pneumonia in 1907. His medical knowledge had made him particularly valuable to prosecutors seeking to understand how legitimate medical procedures had been perverted into torture techniques. But his testimony also revealed the extent of his own participation in crimes that went far beyond passive complicity. Fletcher's detailed descriptions of patient responses to various treatments provided crucial evidence for convicting other participants, while also documenting procedures that had never been imagined by investigators. Thomas Bradley's trial exposed the political corruption that had enabled the sanatorium to operate without oversight for over a decade, leading to a comprehensive investigation of Wisconsin state government that resulted in dozens of resignations and several additional criminal prosecutions. His testimony implicated judges, sheriffs, legislators, and business leaders in a conspiracy that had perverted the state's regulatory systems to protect criminals while exploiting vulnerable patients. Bradley received a 20-year sentence but died in prison after only 3 years, reportedly killed by fellow inmates who had learned the nature of his crimes and decided to dispense their own form of justice. Judge William Hartwell's suicide. On the morning he was scheduled to be arrested prevented his prosecution but confirmed his guilt in the minds of most observers who had followed the case. His detailed confession, found beside his body, provided evidence that led to additional arrests while revealing the extent to which Wisconsin's judicial system had been compromised by the sanatorium's influence. The confession described years of taking bribes to commit patients to the facility while preventing legal challenges that might have exposed its criminal operations, making him an essential enabler of crimes that had cost hundreds of lives. The business leaders who had invested in the sanatorium faced varying degrees of punishment, though their wealth and political connections allowed many to escape serious consequences despite clear evidence of their knowledge about the facility's true operations. Railroad magnate Harrison Blackwood fled to Europe before he could be arrested, while lumber baron Frederick Walsh received only a substantial fine and the loss of his timber holdings near the Sanatorium site. Their ability to avoid prosecution, despite their crucial roles in enabling the Sanatorium's crimes, demonstrated the persistent influence of wealth and social position, even in cases involving the most serious criminal activity. Anna Richardson became a prominent advocate for institutional reform and patients' rights, using her experience investigating her sister's disappearance to establish organizations that monitored medical facilities and protected vulnerable individuals from institutional abuse. Her work led to significant changes in Wisconsin's oversight of medical facilities and inspired similar reform movements in other states that had discovered their own problems with inadequately regulated healthcare institutions. Anna's systematic approach to investigation became a model for advocates who sought to hold institutions accountable for their treatment of patients who lacked the resources to protect themselves. The survivors rescued from the sanatorium required years of treatment to recover from their physical and psychological trauma, but many were eventually able to rebuild their lives and provide testimony that helped convict their tormentors. Emily Richardson, Anna's sister, never fully recovered from her experiences, but lived until 1934 and became a powerful witness whose testimony helped secure convictions in related cases involving other corrupt medical facilities. Her survival provided her sister with the vindication she had sought, while also demonstrating the possibility of recovery even from the most severe institutional abuse. The sanatorium building was demolished in 1892, and the state ordered that no structure could ever be built on the site as a memorial to the victims who had suffered and died there. The land remained empty for decades. The local residents reported strange sounds and unexplained phenomena that made the area a place of fear and superstition. In 1955, the site was converted into a memorial park dedicated to the victims of institutional abuse, with a monument that listed the names of all known patients who had died at the facility. The case established important legal precedents for prosecuting institutional abuse and holding corrupt officials accountable for their complicity in protecting criminal enterprises. The investigation techniques developed by Lieutenant Hayes became standard procedures for examining suspected institutional crimes, while the legal strategies used by prosecutors influenced how similar cases were handled throughout the United States. The Wisconsin legislature passed comprehensive reform laws that required regular inspection of medical facilities and established independent oversight boards to investigate complaints about patient treatment. The St. Mary's Sanatorium case revealed how easily legitimate institutions could be perverted into criminal enterprises when proper oversight was absent and corrupt officials were willing to protect wrongdoers in exchange for personal benefit. The systematic nature of the abuse and the length of time it continued without detection demonstrated the importance of transparency and accountability in institutions that serve vulnerable populations. The case also showed how individual courage and persistence could eventually overcome even well-established networks of corruption and abuse. Modern mental health professionals have studied the sanatorium case as an example of how institutional authority can be used to commit crimes that would be impossible for individuals acting alone, while historians have used it to understand the social and political conditions that allowed such abuse to flourish in late 19th century America. The case continues to influence efforts to protect patients' rights and ensure adequate oversight of medical facilities, serving as a permanent reminder of the potential for evil that exists when good people choose to remain silent about institutional wrongdoing. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.